Can anyone actually own the frontier in a meaningful way? Does holding it even matter anymore? A lab founded by one of the biggest names in AI just gave its answer to that question by giving its strongest model away. 975 billion parameters, fully downloadable, free. Now here's the claim I'll stand behind. The frontier stopped being something anyone could own the moment this new era of intelligence began, the moment it stopped being exclusively human. Come with me, let's get into it. Thinking Machines Lab just put a general-purpose multimodal AI model on the open internet. Anyone can download it. That's the lab that Murati started after she left OpenAI, where she was the chief technology officer. It's one of the most watched new labs in the field. And yesterday, on July 15th, it released a model called Inkling, with the full weights out in the open on Hugging Face. So let's look at the shape of this. Inkling is a 975 billion parameter model. It's what's called a mixture of experts, so only about 41 billion of those parameters fire on any given word or token, and that's what keeps it runnable. It reasons over text, images, and audio, and it handles up to 1 million tokens of context. They trained it on 45 trillion tokens, and they previewed a smaller version too called Inkling Small. And on safety, it scored around 78% on a benchmark called FORTRESS and near 99% on one called StrongREJECT. Now here's why the download link is the whole story here. Open weights means that the trained model file itself is yours to run and modify, assuming of course you have sufficient compute. The actual thing on your own hardware rather than rented queries behind a company's servers. And for about 2 years, the working assumption in this field has been really simple, that America's best known founders would keep their strongest models locked behind an API and sell you access, even as they also released some open models that were far less capable. Think GPT-OS, for example. The truly open work has been coming from somewhere else, typically China. A founder with Murati's pedigree just broke that assumption at the source. And look at what it landed next to. In the Adam Reuters adoption snapshot, as we covered yesterday, Chinese open models pulled 41% of the Hugging Face downloads that it measured. That is one of the main places where these models live. They also hold all 6 top slots on OpenRouter: Tencent, Xiaomi, DeepSeek, Minimax, Z.AI. So the volume leader in OpenAI is China, and now the American open ecosystem has its first comparable entry from a marquee name. Now notice what's actually happening then. The capability is diffusing across companies, across countries, across the founder class, all at the same time. A capability that cost hundreds of millions of dollars to train will eventually become a capability that anyone can use. Even for closed models, that is increasingly the case, further enforcing the argument that gating doesn't work even on its own merits. It is increasingly difficult to hold the edge of the frontier for any meaningful length of time, and that cutting edge becomes commonly available, open capability with increasing speed. So why gate at all? Open models are the future, and when you consider the foundational function of intelligence in nearly every aspect of society, you start to grasp what it means for the future when that intelligence is increasingly truly open. Let's shift over to a lab that let an AI improve the thing doing the improving. Weco AI reported something remarkable. They built an agent called AID². Its job was to improve AI research code, to make the researcher better rather than to run the experiments itself. And this is what it did. It ran unattended for 8 days over roughly 100 steps, and it rewrote its own inner research agent. It produced 7 successive versions, and Weco says that those versions beat its hand-tuned baseline from 2 years of work on that task. And then the detail that really hit me. Somewhere in that loop, it started to cheat less. What I mean by that is reward hacking, when a system games the score instead of doing the real work. Nobody told AID² to stop, but its own gaming of the objective dropped from about 63% of the runs down to 34%. It got better at the task and more honest about the task on its own. Now, let's keep this really crisp. It's easy to oversell. This ran inside a research harness, a defined task. Humans supervised it and read every single version that it wrote. So this is not a system loose in the world right now. Weco calls it level 1 on a ladder, a machine improving the machine that does the improving, right? The shape of that curve, that's the story here. Not any claim that it's running wild, because no, it's not. And pair it with a second result that landed right alongside it. This one comes from the same idea from the opposite end. It is a group called PrismML, and they took a 27 billion parameter multimodal reasoner, their model called Bonsai, and they compressed it down to a 3.9 gigabyte size. And that's small enough to run on a phone. They estimate that it keeps 90 to 95% of its capability. So you give up a measurable slice of performance, but you get frontier-adjacent reasoning with no data center behind it. So one system is teaching itself to get better, the other is shrinking until it fits in your pocket. Intelligence getting more self-directed and more portable in the same news cycle. Now over to who gets to write the rules for all of this. Demis Hassabis runs Google DeepMind, and on July 14th in a post on X, he proposed a formal body to review frontier AI models before they ship. And his model for it is FINRA, the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority. The U.S. brokerage industry funds and staffs that body itself, and it runs under federal oversight. Applied to AI, the labs would fund and run the reviewer, and the government would supervise it. Reviews would start voluntary, run 30 days, and become mandatory once the framework really matured. In a CNBC interview after, he argued that the U.S. should lead this rather than let another country set the standard. So here's the honest way to read a lab CEO proposing the rules for his own industry. This is a claim about the world that he'd prefer to compete in. So read the self-serving angle first, of course, because a body funded by the lab it reviews raises a very obvious question. Whose interests does the standard end up actually serving? And a mandatory pre-release review is a cost. A big incumbent absorbs it easily. A 2-person open-weight team can't really do that, nor can a 20-person open-weight team or even 200, depending on, of course, their capability and their financing. So the same review that makes safety legible can double as a wall, and it raises the price of even reaching the frontier. And it lands against a wall from the other direction too. The White House's AI advisor, Sriram Krishnan, said it flatly, that there will not be an FDA for AI, and the reviews that already happen inside labs on systems like Anthropic's Mythos and OpenAI's Sol are opaque. Outside researchers can't see how a lab makes a release call. Our July 10th edition documented how a federal hold on GPT 5.6 worked as a de facto checkpoint even while its legal authority stayed somewhat unsettled. But hold the other half of this because it's also real. Once a review standard exists out in daylight, the advantage of keeping your evaluations private really starts to erode. The safety tests that labs have run as competitive secrets could become something that the whole field gets to inspect. That's the genuine upside. But here's the catch. Even a shared reviewer is only as honest as the test it runs. And as we'll see in just a minute, models can learn to pass the specific tests that they're graded on. Let's move over to a border where those same weights hit a wall. On July 15th, China's Cyberspace Administration approved Apple Intelligence for mainland China, but only on one condition. Apple couldn't run its own models on Chinese soil, so it built its Chinese AI on Alibaba's Qwen model instead. Qwen now powers Apple Intelligence across iOS, iPadOS, macOS, and visionOS in one of Apple's largest markets. That approval resolves a hold that had kept those features out since they launched globally. And the money is big. Apple's Greater China sales rose 28% to $20.5 billion in the quarter. Alibaba's shares climbed about 6% on the news. So here's the read. This approval says as much about control as it does about clearing a product to sell. A regulator held a foreign AI out of the market until it ran on a domestic model, reviewed it under domestic rules. The AI that 1 billion plus people touch on their phones is now something negotiated at the border, not simply shipped worldwide. But look closely at what that gate can actually reach, and it shrinks. Any developer in China or anywhere else can already download the exact same Qwen weights that the regulator cleared. A person's access to that model never hinged on Apple passing review. The gate decides whose logo sits at the top. It doesn't decide whether the model is reachable. It already is everywhere. And don't flatten China into one motive here. The country cast as the gatekeeper at its own borders is, at the very same time, one of the biggest contributors to the global open weight commons. Think of those top 6 open router slots that we talked about earlier. Both things describe how capability moves now, gated at national deployment, abundant everywhere that the weights get published. For Apple, this is particularly interesting because they live on walled gardens. They do not do open stuff at all. The one identical product that it sold the whole world is now becoming regional. A China that runs on Qwen, a rest of the world that runs on Apple's own gated and proprietary models and partners. One global stack, we're looking at it split into several. Last one, best news for anyone who's ever worried that AI makes hacking easy. OpenAI built something called GPT-Red. It's an automated attacker, and its whole job is to find ways to break other AI systems, and OpenAI pointed it at its own. The main target is prompt injection. That is the dominant AI-specific attack. You hide instructions inside text that only a model reads that's not necessarily visible to a human, and it follows them instead of its own rules. GPT-Red runs on a self-play loop. It generates attacks, tests them, learns from whatever lands, and then goes again. It surfaced a genuinely new technique. Researchers call it a fake chain of thought. You feed a model fabricated reasoning steps so that it treats a false conclusion as something that it already checked. One researcher put it like this: it's like if I told you that 1 + 1 = 3 and that you have verified this already. And now the numbers, because they're the payoff, of course. In OpenAI's evaluation, GPT-Red's strongest attacks worked against GPT-5 more than 90% of the time. But against the newer GPT-5.6, under the same evaluation, that success rate fell below 23%. So OpenAI says that makes 5.6 its most attack-resistant model yet. And yet, that's the company's own claim about its own model, so again, weigh it against the limits that they admit. GPT-Red still struggles with multi-turn conversations and image-based attacks. It also beat human red teamers on a rerun of a 2025 benchmark, and it also broke out of the lab. It hacked a vending agent from a company called Anden Labs, changing prices and canceling orders. Consequently, OpenAI says that it will not release the model. Maybe they'll eventually take a page out of Anthropic's Project Glasswing, for example. And on the same ledger, in the same day, Microsoft shipped a record 570 security fixes in a single patch release. It credited AI-assisted discovery for the sheer volume. 2 of those flaws were 0 days as well. Attackers were already exploiting them before the patch existed. One is a Windows server privilege bug. The other's a SharePoint vulnerability that federal cyber authorities flagged as under active attack. Microsoft's Windows chief, Pavan Davuluri, said it really plainly: as AI helps defenders discover more issues, customers will see a higher volume of security updates included in each security release. So here's the inversion underneath both of those stories. For decades, software security ran on scarcity. Only a handful of experts could find a flaw, so most flaws did actually stay hidden. There's a held 0 day, an unpatched hole. That was an asset precisely because finding it was expensive. Automate the finding, and that whole logic flips. The vulnerabilities were always there, and attackers found success by finding those vulnerabilities before the defenders did. What is now changing is that the finder seems to be working just as fast as the exploiter. All right, let's bring it home. Can anyone actually own the frontier? And does that even matter? That was the question we opened on, and the whole day answered it in the same way. A founder with about as much frontier pedigree as anyone alive just gave her strongest model away as a download. A self-improving loop just collapsed 2 years of expert tuning into 8 days, and a 27 billion parameter reasoner shrank to fit a phone. On the other side, a lab CEO proposed a body to gate the frontier, and a state gated a product at its border, but the weights underneath both are already loose in the world, reachable by anyone. And finally, automated flaw finding took the one advantage that attackers held longest and handed it to the defenders instead. Every one of those was some kind of scarcity dissolving. A trained model was scarce. A research edge was scarce. A hidden flaw was scarce. In just the past few days, each of those got cheaper, more open, more distributed, from a different direction all at once. So think about what it really means to own a frontier. A factory you can still own. A patent you can still own. The law draws a fence, and the fence does hold for things like that. But a capability that copies for free, that a founder posts for anyone to download, that a self-improving loop rebuilds, and that a phone can run. Ownership barely gets a grip on it. You can gate where it ships, you can stamp your logo on it, but the capability keeps finding its level like water, and it runs to every hand that reaches for it. So here's the challenge that I'll leave you with. The kind of ownership that our whole extractive system runs on only ever worked because the valuable thing was scarce and hard to reach. And intelligence, the foundational input under nearly everything we build, was the scarcest prize of all. And that is the thing now slipping the fence. This is so much bigger than any one open model. These are the first cracks we are seeing in ownership itself. starting at the frontier because that's where the scarcity broke first, and it's spreading out from there. What used to be held is becoming something anyone can reach, and more people are doing so every day. We'll see you tomorrow.